The AC75s are impressive machines, the fastest racing monohulls on the planet. But how do crews handle them? How do they keep their beasts on the boil? With just their heads visible, it's really hard to tell. So to find out, I went to go and ask an expert. And that person is Nathan Outteridge, Olympic gold medalist. He's got 8 World Championship titles to his name, 2 of them in the foiling moth class, and countless other victories. He also lives here in Auckland and has spent months out on the water watching the AC75 sailing and seeing how their teams handle the boats. He's also one of the commentators for this entire series. So for me, at least, he was the obvious choice to go and talk to. Nathan, it's been pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, has it been, what's your overall feeling about what we've seen so far, just a few weeks into it?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. You know, the boats are obviously pretty cool and they look quite difficult to sail. We've seen quite a few errors from teams that you would expect to be a bit more polished than what they are. Not so much in the medium winds. I think when it's medium wind strength, you know, like that 11 to 18 knots, I think the boats are got good power and so generate foil lift. But in the lighter conditions, trying to get the things up and foiling, there's a lot of technique involved. You know, it looks like designers have really optimised for speed on these boats, which makes sense, but you see how thin the foils are, how thin the rudders are. As soon as you start asking the foils to do more than what they're designed to do, you know, trying to steer the boat too aggressively, the sections are just letting go. And so you can see boats spinning out in jibes, you can see boats coming off the foils in tacks, you can see boats actually struggling to take off in, you know, what we know is light winds, but 8 knots is not that light, and some people are struggling to foil in 8 knots of breeze.
Are you surprised at how quickly the teams have been able to get up and really lock horns closely? I mean, from my point of view, I think I'm staggered at how close they're prepared to take it already.
Yeah, the racing has been pretty tight. You know, the practice racing, but also what we saw in December. You know, there was no holding back in terms of sailing. But you got to remember, these guys haven't done any racing for a couple of years. You know, the racing that these sailors have done there isn't even in-house racing going on. You know, in Bermuda we had 2 45s foiling. We were doing in-house racing all the time. We were racing some of the other teams. You know, with the way that the rules been written, that you can't interact with other teams at all in this America's Cup cycle. Add COVID to that, wasn't a World Series until recently. They haven't had a chance to do any racing, so all they've been doing is straight line performance verification of what the design is. And so they literally had 4 days to get some racing in. And so they had to push hard, otherwise they were going to be doing it when it counted. And so you see some teams making some errors and some teams, you know, being really strong. And those who have got really good match racing experience, particularly these upwind starts, they were really shining through early on.
Now, you talked about the foils, and you know, it's easy to come off the foils and make these mistakes. I mean, that's another reason why I'm surprised that they're prepared to take it so close, because how much confidence can they really have in machines that they, as you say, haven't raced that much? They haven't actually had that much time on the water. Maybe they've had a lot of time in simulators, but...
Yeah, there's been a fair bit of time in simulators, but my understanding would be is that you're using a simulator to verify the design of the boat. Okay, how does it handle in a straight line? They can throw different sets of foils, different design foils, to see how it takes off differently or performs at speeds, or you know, how it's tacking and that. Some of the teams will have simulators where they can do racing. And so, for example, you take Luna Rossa would be a great example. You've got 2 helmsmen. So if you could give them a simulator each and say, during COVID, we're not allowed to go sailing, the boat's, you know, not there, the second boat's not ready, get a simulator each and they could race. You know, they could be in different parts of the world racing each other. And so they would have been doing all this aggressive racing in computer world, and maybe they've just got on the boats and forgot they're in computer world still, and still going as hard as you would, because you know, you would always push it harder in a simulator because there's no consequences, yeah. Whereas now they're just trying to find that balance, I guess.
Do you think I mean, that's an interesting point as well, because in the case of Luna Rossa, they've had to match 2 helmsmen because there's 1 on each side, as we've seen. How hard do you think that's been to do that, to actually get the guys driving the boat to be as equally matched that you can then trust all the data tack for tack?
It's a good question. I've actually spoken to both Jimmy and Francesco Bruni between the Christmas event and now in January. And I asked them that question. I said, how did you get to this point? where you're going to share and what were sort of the steps. And Jimmy made a really good point. He said the learning was accelerated by two people driving, because normally it's one person driving and one person flying or doing the tactics, and so you have one person's opinion developing a boat to how they want it. But when you have to share that with another person, you get a second opinion and you get really good discussion. And then when you get a person driving and the other helmsman flying on their behalf, you just get two people working together to develop a boat that's going to work best. Now, surely Jimmy and Bruni have different strengths and weaknesses, and surely we would all think one would be better suited to hold the wheel and one could fly it. But they believe that, well, firstly, Bruni said to me, he said, I'm left-handed, so I couldn't fly the boat on the other tack. He said, I'd have to actually switch my hand. He said it wasn't working. And so that's why they are on the sides they are. But I also think that between the two of them, they're just able to develop together, and then when they start manoeuvring, no one's crossing the boat. So it's a clear my wheel, your wheel, job switches. And people say, well, what about the tactician? How they don't necessarily have one. It's like, well, the guy to leeward is effectively the tactician. Yes, it's a lot of concentration to fly these boats, but they can look around and they can see the other boat coming on starboard tack. Jimmy's actually got a pretty big job to play, because when they're on port tack, Bruni's driving. So Jimmy's really calling the tactics when they're on port. Are we crossing? Are we ducking? All that sort of stuff. So I think it's really cool. It's obviously not been done before, and there hasn't really been a boat that lends itself to it like this. Crossing the boat on these boats is, you've got to admit, you can't do a good manoeuvre if you have people climbing across the boat. So if they just job share, instant switch, and in pre-starts, I think it's going to be really strong.
Well, it brings back memories of seeing you disappearing over the side in Bermuda. I mean, that was quite a good example of how you can actually get it wrong.
Absolutely.
I mean, that would be catastrophic, wouldn't it, in one of these races? I mean, you're not going to recover from that. Certainly not in that race.
If your helmsman falls off, you're probably not finishing the race. We saw that in Bermuda, and sure, there's 11 people on this boat, so you could probably find a workaround, and I'm sure everyone's thought about that. But the less people that move, the less chance that someone falls off. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see someone fall off going around the back of those mains. I have to watch Goody and Dean when they're crossing. All it takes is someone just to ease the traveller at the wrong moment, and boom, hits the shoulder and over the gunwale you go.
Now, what I should have pointed out just at the beginning of the interview is, because we were looking for a nice shot over the basin and we can see Ineos and American Magic and we can see out to the water, we positioned ourselves right over, well, it's not a main road, but it's quite a busy road, so apologies for all the traffic that's going backwards and forwards, but we did it in the interest of a good view and putting Nathan in the mood where he could look out to the water and imagine.
And wish that I was actually sailing.
Exactly, yeah. So let's have a quick run through of what the roles are on the boat, because actually in these boats, because the crews are sunken down in the cockpits, and for a lot of them, unless you're the helmsman or the trimmer, from a spectator's point of view, all you see is a bunch of heads and maybe some elbows flailing around. So if we go from the front back, talk us through what the key roles are.
Yeah, well, the way they've set up the boats is actually quite interesting. Like, part of the going to an AC75 was to see more crew work in action, and in fact we've actually seen less than what we saw in Bermuda, because no one's crossing. It's pretty obvious. You've got more or less 4 grinders on each side, so most teams are made up of 8 grinders, and then you've got 3 people towards the back that are sort of pulling the strings, so to speak. So you've got grinders. Most of the grinders are producing hydraulic pressure. Fundamentally the boats are powered, everything below the water is powered by batteries, but the grinders are powering everything that happens above the water. So the traveller movement, the main sheet, the Cunningham, the outhaul, the standard controls for your sails, the jib sheet has to be, always manually driven, and the runners and things like that too. So, people just think they turn handles not thinking about what they're doing. They actually have roles and responsibilities, and you'd be surprised how technical the software is on these boats and how they actually have to shift gears. Because, for example, if you want to pull the main sheet on, it's going to be heavily loaded. So when someone wants to when the main trimmer wants that on, the grinders have to shift to the correct gear to get the correct speed, and as it comes on and gets tighter and tighter, they're having to foot pedal shift through the gears. So there'll be dedicated mainsail trimmers, there'll be dedicated jib trimmers, because that's on a winch, it's not hydraulic. And so those 4 people or 8 people, call it, are sharing those roles. Some teams have got grinders at the front. Team New Zealand's got 2 at the back on each side, 2 at the front on each side, and then the sailors, Pete and Blair. Well, Blair actually sits at the front, but Pete and Glennie sort of sit in the middle. So each team's done it slightly differently, but in general there's 8 grinders and there's 3 sailors who are driving and trimming things. So the other big role on these boats is like a dedicated flight controller. I think everyone saw in Bermuda in that America's Cup the power of having a dedicated flight controller, which is Blair Chute. So that meant the helmsman could actually focus on racing and tactics, and kind of took away that helmsman-tactician relationship. And so what you actually have now, especially on Team New Zealand, and all teams for that matter, is they have a dedicated flight controller who is adjusting the flaps on the foil, probably getting involved in adjusting the rudder to maintain the correct pitch, which means that the helmsman, is a bit more freed up. I've looked really closely, and you can see some teams have got mainsail trimmers, but Team New Zealand don't look like Glenn Ashby's trimming that main. He's sitting on the leeward side. How can he honestly be trimming the mainsail to leeward? I honestly believe that Pete's on the wheel has the ability to do heel control. So I'm pretty confident he's doing traveller and driving. So it's funny, I think it's a big advantage to do that, because what do you do with the wheel? You turn left and right for what reason? To kind of manage the heel on these boats. If he can just bear away slightly and trim it on just slightly himself, the boat's going to be in a narrower groove. Yeah. But I think what Glenn's actually doing to leeward is he's controlling the global power of the boat. So he's got Cunningham, Outhaul, in the tacks he would be there, deepening it up, twisting things. I'm sure he's trimming the jib because he's sitting to leeward at that winch. Whereas you look at some of the other teams like Ineos, all the other teams, they have a main trimmer sitting behind the helmsman with the Game Boy controller doing all of that for them. And I'm sure each helmsman has the ability to take the traveller. We hear them talking about that in manoeuvres. But I think Pete's doing it pretty much the whole time.
So the analogy as you described that, which is really interesting to hear, the analogy that springs to mind, it sounds like the Kiwis are sailing it in the way that you might sail a dinghy, where if you're helming, you've got the main sheet in your hand and the crew is doing Cunningham out or jib, all that kind of stuff, whereas the other teams are sailing it more big boat style, where the helmsman's steering and you've got a main sheet operator, a main sheet trimmer.
That's exactly what I see happening here. I think about a foiling boat is really difficult to sail, and every time you introduce a new person into the loop, and I did a lot of stuff on the catamarans, sitting next to Goobs all the time, you'd have to think, you'd have to share a brain. I'm pressing, he's easing, I'm coming up. Whereas if one person did it, you'd just avoid those small mistakes, all those reactions. And so imagine going sailing on a Moth 2-up. One person drives, one person trims. Probably wouldn't work very well. But if you can just do little bits with both hands, you find your narrow groove in your way. And I think, Pete and Blair and Glenn are dinghy sailors at heart, and they wanted to make this boat work like a dinghy.
But do you think that the kind of learning that's coming out of the pros here will accelerate that development? Do you think that there's actually may well be a step towards foiling monohulls, dinghies and those kind of boats, as a result of what's been learnt in these boats?
I think there has to be. I think that they always talk about this trickle down, and I look at this as a trickle up. This is a Moth on steroids, all right? And yes, you've got a lot of systems and power and there's more people on it, but fundamentally it performs the same way as a Moth, except you get riding moment from the weight of the boat and the foil to leeward, as opposed to it being directly under you. But chatting to the guys who sail the boats, they say it's just a big Moth. And the question is can you create a mid-size boat that the average sailor can sail? Because not everyone could sail a Moth. It's a very difficult boat to sail. But once you get the fundamentals of it, it's possible. The bigger a boat becomes, the more inherent stability it has, the less, I guess it becomes more docile the bigger it gets. And, I've spoken to a few guys that sail these boats, and they say compared to their test boats, which were much smaller, these things are way easier to sail.
Really?
They say they go a bit quicker and the loads are tremendous. But in terms of how you sail the boat, a lot of the skills that they've learnt to sail the 75s came from their test boats. Like the Mule, for example, Team New Zealand had a little one as well. I think all the teams had little boats to test. And they said, actually, if you take one more step and go back into a moth, you've got to get the basics there. Pete's a moth world champion. Blair's really handy in a moth. Glenn's good in moths and ACATs. Goody's a really good moth sailor. You look through the fleet. Bruni's a great moth sailor. Jimmy's done it.
Yeah.
You can see where you got to get, as a kid, where you'd want to be getting your skills to do these type of boats.
And I guess, it's happening all over the world, at least where there's sailing, but you certainly notice it here when you go out around the harbour and you see the number of people who are kite foiling. They're doing, what's it called where you've got the actual wing on a foil?
Well, there's the winging, there's the kite foiling, and there's the foil windsurfing as well.
And so many people are doing it.
Everyone's doing it at Auckland here now.
So there's this
amazing.
sort of, I guess that's all leading towards, when we do have foiling in bigger boats, there's these sort of inbuilt skills, the same way as you'd learn to dinghy sail and you'd be pretty handy on a keel boat.
But if you're a kid listening, the important thing is you've got to get basic sailing skills first. So you've got to start in a traditional boat. You can't just forget learning in an Optimus or a small dinghy. You've got to go in something that's slow, so you understand the wind and how boats work, then jump into foiling classes. But if you jump straight in a Wasp or a Moth or something, you're never going to get to the same level as if you started the traditional route.
There speaks the man who's just become a parent for the second time. Could you tell?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, kids, this is what you have to do.
The Optimus is a lot cheaper than a Moth.
So I hope you found that interesting, and if you did, you may be pleased to know that in fact the interview was a lot longer than that, and I just couldn't bring myself to let any of it fall on the cutting room floor. So there is a part 2 coming, keep your eye out for it, and I wouldn't mind betting that once you've listened to the second part, you'll start looking at these boats in a slightly different light. Till next time. Thank you.